All right. Yeah. So, hi. My name is Dan. I work on React team at Facebook. This is not a talk about React. It's just random musings on JavaScript ecosystem. But first, I don't know if you saw the news yesterday, but I'm just so glad. We are relicensing React, JS, Flow, and Immutable JS under the MIT license, so we can just stop talking about this. With that out of the way, this is a talk about the JavaScript ecosystem. And people have very different opinions about JavaScript ecosystem. When I talk to both people new to the ecosystem and people who have spent some time with it, people don't agree with each other. And some people, can I see the emojis? Okay, maybe. Yeah, so some people say that we live in a time of JavaScript Renaissance with all these amazing tools. And other people say that it's incomprehensible and it's impossible to work with. Everything is very fragile. And I think, I understand both of these points and empathize with both of them. But I think the reason it came to be this way is that JavaScript ecosystem, it's not, to me, it's unlike any other ecosystem I work with. I think the metaphor that most closely resembles it for me is the melting pot. Because, well, this is a honey pot because there's no melting pot emoji, but it's close enough. So I use this metaphor because I think without a single vendor controlling it and setting the direction, the JavaScript ecosystem most closely resembles the human culture. So it's very messy, it's incremental, it's inconsistent, it's trying to mimic and adapt everything on its way, and it's also beautiful. But sometimes there is just too much pain. So the question for me is, I'm curious what we can do better as creators of tools to alleviate some of that pain and hopefully make the JavaScript ecosystem better. And I have some ideas. These are not new ideas, but I want to share them with you today. But first, let's look at how we came to this place. Why are we having this problem right now? And I think what's happening is that if you look at the stories behind other platforms, if you develop for Microsoft Desktop, like people did 10 years ago, or for iOS or Android, like people do today, you usually have a single vendor that provides the tools and that tells everyone, here's the one right way to do it. Here's how you do your UI. Here's how you do data fetching. Here is how you do whatever our platform allows. And they also provide you with a standard library, an SDK, a compiler, or a static type checker, or dynamic or whatever, but they give you the tools that are approved and that are the right solutions. And depending on the ecosystem, it can be thought as a recommendation, or people follow it really strictly. It depends on the mentality. But JavaScript is different because nobody really thought, well, I don't know, probably some visionaries thought, but it seems like 15 years ago, nobody really thought web would be this kind of dynamic application platform. And so what happened is, at the time, the standard committees were spending years, with all respect to them, discussing the future of a document-centric web. The application developers realized that actually the advantages of having a platform that allows you to deliver cross-platform apps on demand and they can be rich and they can be interactive, the advantages of having a platform like this are worth the downsides of having no standard library and no SDK and no compiler. And so the first bigger companies like Google started experimenting with GWT and Clojure compiler and building all sorts of like meta platforms around the web platform. And later, individuals started doing the same thing. And so instead of vendor-mandated tools, we have these application developers who just realize that, okay, like I need this, I need to optimize this code. So I guess I have to learn about parsing and AST manipulation and compiler optimizations and all this kind of stuff. And what you see in the JavaScript ecosystem is that a lot of the tool builders, they did not like want to become the tool builders. They just had to build tools for their projects, and they kind of got into it. Sebastian McKenzie, if I'm not mistaken, implemented Babel as just a way to learn how a compiler works. And so you have these tools created by app developers to solve their problems, but of course they don't agree on anything. And this is how we end up in this situation where we have every project has this giant dependency tree with different build tools, and nobody agrees on which build tools to use because there is so much innovation happening there that they quickly obsolete each other. So we have these different trees. And you realize that actually, since NPM 3, so NPM 3 flattens node modules, and you actually get to see the transitive dependencies in your node modules folder directly. And I think this was a wake-up call for many people. They were like, whoa, I'm depending on so many people. Like, is this sustainable? And I don't have a solution to that. The previous talk was a good idea of a possible solution. But you just realize that there are so many strangers you actually depend on. So there's a great talk about this. I encourage you to check it out. It's called The Social Coding Contract. I did not watch it, but I looked I looked at the slides. The slides were so great I did not have to watch it, but the slides are amazing. Check it out. It dives into some moral, ethical, and technical issues around depending on so many people. But it's not even the amount of code, this like mountain of doom of dependencies that concerns me, because I think sustainability, we can solve it. I'm optimistic about it. I think if we have too much abstraction, packages that are unnecessary, they're going to be linear alternatives that are going to replace them. If some polyfills become unnecessary, we're going to delete them. If multiple tools are similar, but like if multiple tools want to depend on similar infrastructure, they're going to share it eventually. So I think that the code itself and the amount of code itself and the build tooling is not the biggest problem for me. So the biggest problem for me, okay, so there's still some contrast. The biggest problem for me is the configuration and the proliferation of the configuration. And this is like the thing that when I talk to beginners, and not just beginners, experienced engineers who come to JavaScript ecosystem, they're puzzled by the amount of configuration you have to add to your project to basically do anything. And I think this is really harmful. There is another point of view, which is that my project is not going to have a config. My tool, I don't have a single tool. I will create an ecosystem of small tools that are chained together in a beautiful Unix philosophy kind of piping way. And it's probably great. I sort of went there with Redux, and we have this middleware system. So in my experience, it doesn't really work. It's a trade-off. And the reason it breaks down because you can, if you're trying to be super flexible, you have to put configuration somewhere, and it's either explicit as a configuration file, or it's implicit in the way you have to know to chain these things together so that the pieces fit. And if you don't, usually you have to, I mean, not usually, but most often in my experience, you have to understand their internals and the way they are wired up together to actually combine them together in the right way. And at that point, you've already kind of lost the benefits of the abstraction because you have to understand their internals. And a person who's new to these tools will not be able to figure it out correctly. Or you may keep resisting learning about their internals, and whenever you don't understand why something doesn't fit, you just hack around it. And you end up with this pile of hacks. And I mean, I did that. There is an amazing post by Katie Sierra. Unfortunately, she doesn't post anymore. There's been a lot of harassment, and she quit Twitter. But she wrote an amazing post 4 years ago, which really resonated with me, and it resonates even harder with me today. It's called Your App Makes Me Fat, and it's about apps in general, but I think it applies really well to JS ecosystem. So I'm just going to read some parts of this post. It's very good. If you ask the user to make choices, even they are both clear and useful, the act of deciding is a cognitive drain. And not just while they're deciding. Even after we choose, an unconscious cognitive background thread is slowly leaking resources. Was that the right choice? And another fragment. If our work drains users' cognitive resources, what does he lose? What else could he have done with those scarce, precious, easily depleted resources? Maybe he's trying to stick with a diet, or practice guitar, or play with his kids. And so, in my opinion, we use, as tool builders, we often view configuration as a feature. Somebody tells us, well, like if you just have this feature, I'll be able to use this project at my company. And you think, great, I'm helping people by adding it. But we should factor in the invisible cost that it causes both for people who use that feature and for people who don't use it. It's the cost of learning about this feature, the cost of people misunderstanding it. Specifically talking about configuration, the cost of people thinking, was that the right thing to do? Was that did I pick the right option? And maybe we should instead invest that effort into picking better defaults. And if the default is not good enough, maybe we should work on making it good enough and figuring out a way to make it work for everybody. If you are building tools like me, there is this fact that we have become the new gatekeepers to one of the largest programming communities in the world. And this is scary stuff, because it means that every time our tool prints an incomprehensible error message, somebody somewhere decides that they're just not cut out for programming. And this is a big responsibility. But it's not all grim and dark. I think we can do better, and it's actually not that hard. And there are projects we can learn from that I think do a great job at this. So I picked Ember and Elm here, although I'm sure there are plenty more projects like I like everything that Zaid does. I'm a fan. But I think these projects are great examples of taking the newcomer experience and the cognitive drain for existing users seriously and actually caring about it. So there's a few strategies that I think we as tool makers can follow. Again, not new ideas, I did not invent this, but I'm just going to enumerate some of them that make sense to me. Configuration should not stand in the way of getting started. If you're creating a tool, a person, in my opinion, a person doesn't have to create a configuration file to start using it. There is almost always a reasonable default you can come up with for every configuration option. And if you can't, if you think, well, this is totally arbitrary, well, that's fine. You can come up with a convention. You can follow an existing convention, the ecosystem. You can come up with your own and say, well, the input file is going to be called input.js by default, and that there is nothing bad with picking it. And eventually, tools start to see each other's conventions, and to play better with each other, they start to converge. And at that point, you will see that it's easier to switch between projects, because even if projects use different tools, actually they share some common set of conventions. And we should really learn this, learn from Ember and from Elm, and apply this to the React ecosystem, in my opinion. But even if you can't extinguish all configuration, at least resist adding more configuration than absolutely necessary. And what is absolutely necessary? Well, that depends on your project, but I like the way Christopher Shadow put it, discussing Prettier. So Prettier is an opinionated code formatter created by James Long and Christopher Shadow. And at first, it didn't have any options at all. It was just formatting the code they thought looked good. And they would not, like, people would ask for all sorts of configuration options, but they just said, no, we're going to make it good first, and when it's really good, we're going to consider some of these options. And what Christopher Shadow said is that if some option is so important to people that they're never going to use the tool, to a large portion of community, that they're never going to use the tool unless it's implemented, we're going to do it. Okay, so like they added the support for no semicolon, because people are very rational, and this is apparently dividing our community. So as a tool maker, again, this is not just a question of adoption. Think of the bigger picture. What is happening to the community? Adding configuration is a cognitive cost for all your users, but fracturing the community into, like fragmenting into several forks that basically do the same thing is also a cognitive drain. So you have to pick which one is bigger, and you have to pick what is more important to the users. But what I suggest is just, somebody suggests something to be configurable, say, yeah, maybe, and just leave it there and wait for like 100 replies. And if you see that this is really fragmenting your community, then add it. The next thing I think we could do better is disclose advanced features progressively. So even if some option is really necessary, you added it, it's required in some cases. It doesn't mean it's always required. So what you could do if, for example, maybe you need to, like maybe you're building a build tool and you need to know the output code path to write the file to, but it doesn't matter in development scenario because you have like a dev server and it doesn't actually write anywhere. So in this case, you might as well not ask for the output path, and only when the user runs build, you can say, oh, whoa, whoa, whoa. Actually, now you should specify this option, it's important for this scenario. So this way, by not requiring everything up front, you're actually educating the user why this configuration is necessary. And it's very important to educate the user in the context of using the tool, because if you have educated users who understand what this configuration means, they will explain it and pass this knowledge on to the next users. Whereas if they don't understand it, you end up with an ecosystem where everybody copy and pastes configs without understanding what they do. And this is a real problem for beginners and for experienced engineers as well. So this seems like an obvious one, but it's actually not. Mind your output. Try to forget about your tool and look at it with a fresh eyes, and you'll see that its output is just garbage. And like I say this as a person who writes error messages and looks at them later, and I'm like, whoa, it's I would not find the relevant part in this error message because it needs some white space to breathe. It needs less jargon. It needs a link to the page that explains what to do. So unactionable output is the worst. It's like we are harming people learning JavaScript and people learning tools, and not just our tools. So to give you an example, and again, I'm not trying to dismiss anybody's work, I'm just talking about what I'm familiar with. So Yarn had a bug that, and again, I love the Yarn team, no disrespect, but Yarn had a bug that printed pure dependency warnings for things that were not actually mistakes. So there was a bug that caused false positive pure dependency warnings. And they fixed it pretty quickly, so big thanks to them. But I am sure that there exists a couple hundred of developers that ignore all pure dependency warnings now, because they have been trained to not, that this is garbage, that this output doesn't mean anything, and now they just don't read it. And the worst thing is that if one tool does it, then it affects all other tools, because you just learned that, well, tools always print some misleading info. And so people file issues saying, hey, I got this error message, what do I do? And the error message says, to fix this, you need to do this. But we've taught people not to read error messages because our output is garbage. And it's not just about error messages, it's also about regular logs. So make sure, use the white space. It's not bad to use the white space. For some reason, developers hate the white space. No, use the white space. If you have a build error, then I have another build error. Add some white space between them so it's obvious that these are separate things, or better clear the screen. Use colors, use them wisely, don't overuse them. Don't use like more than 2 colors on the same, in the same message. And also be mindful of different terminals. I would just suggest to use red sign and default color, because these mostly work great on all platforms. And consider accessibility as well. There are tools that check contrast, learn about the color contrast and colorblind people, how they interpret your messages. So just think about these things, they're really important. And finally, I'm not sure how much time I have left. Okay, we're a bit over the time, but the last point is that can you raise hands if you created your last project by copying the previous project and just deleting? Okay. Yeah. Can you raise hands if you created a project by cloning a boilerplate? Okay. Yeah. So that's my opinion. You may not agree with it. I think if you have to do this, you're operating on the wrong level of abstraction. You don't take libraries that you use and copy and paste them into your project. You npm install them. So why do you copy and paste the build setups? Because once you fork them into your project, they're now your responsibility, and they are unique for every project. So the maintenance cost is multiplied by the number of projects you work on. So there is a simple solution to this. Create toolboxes. I hope this term sticks. I'm not sure if it's going to work, but I'm calling this toolboxes. Toolbox is a package that depends on several other packages. So like you can create your own package that depends on Bubble, ESLint, Jest, Webpack, whatever you use, a bunch of tools that specifies their versions and that offers some higher level, more constrained API on top of them. And that API may be as simple as a set of NPM scripts, like my toolkit start, my toolkit test, my toolkit lint. So you have this high-level API that is very simple, and all configuration and the build dependencies are contained in this single package. And then you just publish that package, whether internally at your company's NPM registry or whatever you use, or you publish it to NPM. And all your projects can now share the same setup. And if you want to upgrade Bubble, you update it once in one place. And you see that you can verify that it actually works with all the other tools that you have there. And if it doesn't work, like you can revert and release another update. But for your projects, it's just a single version bub of a single dependency. So it's much easier to, because there is no configuration or like minimal configuration if you want to expose it, it's much easier to update. And that's the approach we use in Create React App. So this is where I plug the thing I'm working on. It's like a boilerplate generator, but it doesn't give you this boilerplate. It doesn't like force you to fork our configuration. The configuration is hidden. We give you a constrained environment, a toolkit, and we offer an escape hatch if you really want to like fork your own setup. But I think this is an interesting way to constrain the configuration and kind of fight back against this proliferation of configuration. And I've heard from several people that they've consolidated their companies' build dependencies in a single package. This worked really well for them. I encourage you to try this approach out and let me know what you think. I'm open to feedback, but toolkits, yeah. And so that's my last point. If you're thinking, I'm just an app developer, I'm not a toolkit builder, I'm not contributing to build tools. Well, you don't have to. We all started this way. The majority of us, we're not like compiler people or something like this. We just needed something for our projects. And we spend so much time looking at our projects that we forget what it's like to use them for the first time. So we welcome your feedback. We'd like to know if it's confusing the way the messages are printed, or if you can think of a better phrasing, if you think there's a bunch of lower level tools that could be better abstracted behind a higher level, simpler dependency, give that feedback to us, make proposals, be polite, please, but it's very valuable feedback. If you're a maintainer, I encourage you to check out initiatives like volunteering initiatives like CodeBar. So CodeBar is a space where people can come to, and it's focused on underrepresented minorities. But the basic idea is that people can come and sign up as coaches or sign up as people who want to learn, and they pair and just learn from each other. And if you are maintainer of an open source project, it is invaluable to go out there in the field and see how people, what they struggle with as they try to use your projects. And this, I think that if you think improving newcomer experience is polish, it's not polish. If you go out there in the field, you will see that it makes a real difference in people's lives and in what they can learn and what they can build with it. So it's not just polish. Take this seriously. And I know it can seem daunting, and the road ahead can seem, oh, like, we're never gonna fix this, but I don't believe it, because I've seen projects do 100% turnaround in a matter of months, when there was high quality feedback and there was a will to improve and people had these values. So I'm optimistic that with incremental improvements and high quality feedback, we can make the JavaScript ecosystem and tooling better for the next person who tries it tomorrow. And I can't wait to see what they build with it. Thank you.